A majority of the viewers of this film likely live in one of the world's market capitalisms, places where consumption, the utilization of debt, and the accumulation of wealth are strongly encouraged. But this isn't necessarily greed, merely the current version of economics, and the following critique of greed should not necessarily be confused with the critique of fair market capitalism. Indeed, true capitalism is a bit of an ethical anomaly, insomuch as it both embraces and condemns greed. This is because greed is not an economic principle, but an ethical one, an odious and horrible vice that wounds humanity, impedes progress, perpetuates fallacy, wastes resources, and above all fosters social cruelty. Greed is a very bad part of the human story, but it is one that comes from very unlikely origins. Long before humans built cities, founded banks, invented economics, or hoarded useless items like Fabergé eggs, humans lived relatively simply as hunters and gatherers. Life was hard. Wild game was not easy to catch. Edible plants were not regularly accessible. Food could not be stored. Shelter, healthcare, and security were not easily available and could not be bought. Survival was tough, gritty. And then something changed. Sometime around 12,000 years ago, humans began to build villages, then towns, then cities, and finally city-states. The tamer animals were domesticated, crops were planted, and trade goods were produced. As the food supply stabilized, more specialized goods could be made. Luxuries, entertainment products, domestic services, luxury services. If you were not a slave or a servant, this kind of living was substantially more affluent via its nomadic lifestyle. But right away, city life created an economic problem. On the steppe, everything had some kind of inherent value. But in cities full of obscure trinkets or services, everything that could be acquired did not necessarily have value. This problem quickly scaled up the more objects that existed. The more that was, the harder it was to value everything, both empirically and in relation to each other. To solve this problem of exchange, of equivalency, humans invented something called money, and with it, greed. At the most basic level, money was invented as a means of exchange, a denomination of value, and a form of wealth storage. The first two attributes were influential in the modernization of mankind, but it was the third quality, the ability to store value, that created greed. In an optimal universe, the ability money has to store value could be used to secure a sensible living for an individual, or used by a society to store resources for useful projects. But this is not at all how humans have used money. Instead of using money for a sensible lifestyle, many humans have used it to fund a nonsensical lifestyle. Those with money use its wealth storage ability to amass excessive wealth, then use that wealth to become kings, buy better access to justice, or to attack and enslave neighboring nations or peoples. Often this is done simply to accumulate more wealth. That is greed. The first problem with greed is that it is a self-perpetuating fallacy. In the end, greed really exists only to sponsor more of itself. It does not produce or create anything other than its own continuation. Users of greed sacrifice all other values in the service of greed. Thusly, greed is clearly a vice insomuch as it only perpetuates itself, and for shallow return. The extreme wealth associated with greed can be so easily taken away, confiscated, stolen, rusted, melted down, or otherwise lost. And no one has ever been looked on fondly for their excessive greed. Greed is destructive because it is a fallacy, a false altar that has no universal value. The second problem caused by greed is social stagnation. Making vast sums of money does not require innovation, merely a high position on an economic pyramid. As a result, the greedy are often opposed to innovation. Creating new and better things is not pursued because it will, or it is perceived to hurt the bottom line. How bad can this get? Well, it can get so bad that it destroys entire civilizations. In both Babylonia and ancient Rome, it was simply more lucrative to accomplish tasks via slave labor than to innovate new things like the steam engine. Innovation is often the result of genius inventors, but it also has to be socially encouraged. Greed drags that encouragement by putting the vested interest of the very wealthy against innovation. And that's the unfortunate truth for those greedy men who still style themselves as innovators. The third and final problem with greed is in the vast social cruelty it causes. No matter how cleverly the masters of mankind argue otherwise, the basic needs of all humans are about the same. The greedy say the opposite, arguing that their own basic needs, or more to the point, their luxury needs, are somehow thousands of times more important than anybody else's. This contention of greed is so virulent that those suffering from greed advocate for the active oppression of everyone else. It is an ethical calamity that the greedy mass resources while the poor or middle class starve. But more to the point, the fact that greed usually causes the poverty and starvation it ignores is an ethical atrocity. Unlike violence, greed on its own will not destroy society. Its long-term interaction is far more subtle, acting instead like a parasite sucking valuable resources away from a healthy host in order to perpetuate an aberration. The continuation of greed as it exists now, as humanity continues to advance and expand into space, will be very destructive. When you look into outer space, it is hard not to see that it is full of the wonders of creation. What it is not full of, at least for humans, is luxury. On Earth, humans were given a perfect biosphere to grow up in. Sure, Earth was cosmically small, but she provided humanity a myriad of free commodities like air, water, gravity, heat, sunlight, a magnetosphere, and food. The Warrens of space provide none of these things, and the vast majority of solar systems will only provide a portion of the environmental orgy given freely on the planet Earth. Here is where greed is so destructive. Greed has been very destructive on Earth, but at least those suffering as a consequence of greed could enjoy the universal luxury of the planet Earth. In addition, much of the greed on Earth has been centered on the accumulation of arbitrarily good possessions like $50,000 suits or Fabergé eggs. But in space or other planets, the greedy will be able to not just needlessly hoard arbitrary items, but also empirically useful ones. Don't like how the greedy throw bowling balls at 100,000 bottles of champagne while you starve? Well, just imagine how much power and how unjust it will be when those same greedy people will have over you control of oxygen, gravity, drinking water, or even sunlight. You might not have thought about it that way, but technology does not just enhance humanity's strengths. It multiplies our vices as well, hardening them and increasing their destructive effect. The more humanity advances technology, the more widely and severely the effects of greed will be felt, if greed as an art is not checked. As I'll stress throughout this video project, the worst outcome for the human race is not actually our destruction, it's our expansion into space as the villains, as the bad guys, essentially. The species that goes and builds and all the other races kind of run in fear from us. And certainly there's a potential for that. You know, we're predators, very dangerous in large groups, made some very stupid decisions over the ages. And greed factors right into that. You know, if we go into space and we're greedy, we're gluttonous, we hoard resources needlessly, we're going to be the villains. I don't think And I mean, this is just pure speculation, but I don't think the vast number of races in the cosmos are more greedy than humanity. There probably are some that are more greedy than us, but probably most aren't. Advanced civilizations require a lot of cooperation. And if we are the greedy ones, if we are seen as greedy, that's going to factor very poorly against us in the court of public opinion. Species that are far more communal will look on our greed very negatively. If the ants or the bees or the sea anemone were the ones that won the species for survival and not the apes, there's a good chance that they're not going to look on greed as friendly as we do. Curing the malice of greed is difficult, but not exactly impossible, because greed isn't innately human. As noted before, human sentience allows us to ignore our programming. That practice is difficult, but what is much easier is accepting our programming and being ourselves. That's the good news about greed. Greed is not a natural human characteristic. We invented it, and as such, it's much easier to dispel. Think about young human children playing or operating in a group. Are they greedy? I, in the vast overwhelming amount of data, would say no. Observe young humans for hours. They will play, fight, cry, share, and yes, be possessive of a toy or a teacher. But this latter behavior isn't greed. Nay, it is only later, when children are taught about greed from adults, that they become greedy. Even then, it's a hard take. I mean, think about it. How many truly greedy people do you know personally? It's probably not that many. You might know a few, but not that many who are truly excessively greedy. And if I'm wrong about that, you might consider finding some different people to hang around with, because greedy people are really not that prevalent. Humans are simply too social and familial of creatures to be excessively greedy on a wide scale. Our entire society would collapse if we were. We care so much for those close to us. That is our nature, and that is a nature that we should get back to. The first and most important way to solve greed is in the personal improvement of the individual. And greed is a conscious choice made by the individual for any number of reasons. So to avoid it, humans simply need to avoid building or centering their lives on material possessions. Who you are is not about what you own physically, nor is it based in the excessive possessions that may improve you. Those do not improve you as an individual. Money is a tool that can be used to accomplish goals, not something that can be used to attain joy. No one will ever be satisfied with it, nor will it lead you to anywhere other than the place that you already started, aka the acquisition of more excessive wealth. Anyone and everyone can come to that conclusion and reject greed, and everyone should remind each other and themselves of that fact. The personal improvement of the individual can obviously not be legislated in a free society, but something can be done socially to address greed. Currently, most human societies rank material wealth as a penultimate value, second only to social loyalty, and an extremely desirable accomplishment that glorifies the user and is second to a human society. Those with material wealth are also allowed vast social access, not just to luxuries like yachts, but also to social institutions like premier legal advice or political influence. This is unfortunate, as it deeply encourages greed. To dissuade greed, societies need to stop encouraging it. Social standing and social access should not be based on material wealth and should be forever divorced from money. Social standing and respect should not just be linked to how many zeros you have in your stock portfolio, but to more worthy benchmarks like education level, personal accomplishment, individual character, and above all, universal benchmarks under the law. There are two principal counter-arguments to the idea that greed is bad. One, that greed is useful for, say, the individual who is greedy, and two, that greed is useful in the sense that it motivates some kind of productive action. The first one is ridiculous and should be thrown out. There's a term for someone that only does things that benefits themselves, irregardless of how those consequences affect others, including their own children. And that term is a monster. The second is a little more complex. Yes, it's true in the system that we've created, greed does motivate certain kinds of productive behavior, invention in some cases, certainly productivity, things like that. However, I can think off the top of my head of about 50 different ways of motivating people alternatively. Spirituality, communalism, desire to benefit the whole species. Certainly as we go out into space, there's going to be species that are not strictly motivated by greed. And even humans are not strictly motivated by greed. Greed is not a natural characteristic of man. Those who say otherwise are lying. While humans do have natural needs for food, shelter, or health care, it's important to understand that we do not have a natural need for an alarming excess of those requirements. That's simply not how we were built. Humans do not need to be greedy and are not naturally greedy, and are limited by the fact that we are, in fact, greedy and have invented greed. You can't take it with you when you die. Yet humans are perpetually greedy, hoarding or wanting to hoard vast sums of money or vast resources. This must stop. Greed is counterproductive to the human experience and is ethically indefensible. One of the primary concerns as we evolve forward is to eliminate this horrible institution and this horrible practice.